everybody. Thank you for sticking around. I know it's close to lunch, but I promise this is worth it. My name is Kellie Gerardi, and I am a defense strategist. I've worked with DARPA, Masten Systems, Commercial Spaceflight Federation, and I am very excited today to introduce you to a special panel to talk about the upcoming Hulu series, The First. As you may already know, the show is set in the not-so-distant future and depicts the first human journey to Mars, focusing not only on the astronauts, but on their families and the ground crew back home on Earth. So joining me on stage today are writer and producer Beau Willimon, the creator of House of Cards, and the creator and executive producer of The First, and former JPL director and Caltech vice president, Dr. Charles Elachi, who serves as an expert advisor to The First, and award-winning director and actress LisaGay Hamilton, who joins an impressive cast in The First and plays one of the show's most experienced astronauts. So, before we jump into a discussion, Beau has graciously offered to share with us a first look at the series. And in this circle of trust, I'm going to ask that no one photographs or records any of the media that's shared with you on screen today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beau for a quick introduction to the series.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for supporting, interplanetary exploration. It's a real honor to be on this stage and share a little bit of the work that we've been doing with you all. Certainly, conferences like this, or Humans to Mars in DC, or the international, or the IAC, these sort of events, which we've relied heavily upon in order to do our research, help us create the most realistic speculation of what travel to Mars will look like in the near future. So we want to tell the human story of that exploration on the one hand, and on the other hand, we want to make sure that our science and our tech and all of the details are as accurate as they could possibly be, because in order to imagine what the future could look like, we need to root it in the reality of now. So we're going to show you about a 90-second teaser here that give you a little taste of the show, and then we also have a slideshow where we can quickly take you through, give you an idea of some of our hardware and some of the questions that we posed, and I'm hoping that we can have a little bit of a discussion not only about the technical side, but also really all of the human considerations of that 2.5-year round-trip journey to the fourth planet from the sun. So let's go ahead and play the clip.
They all say the same thing. I'll believe it when I see it. But that's backwards. Belief comes first. Only then can you see it. I'm asking you to use your imagination.
We've got one shot at this, and I need the best team.
My focus right now is my daughter. Tell me to say no, I'm gonna say no. What we do is dangerous.
I'm willing to take that risk.
I don't know if I am.
How does that make you feel, putting your lives at that much risk? What about your family?
All our families know what we signed up for. Do you ever think about Mom?
You can't let her bring us down too.
Denise, open the door, baby.
Did we make a mistake?
I've got 4 people whose lives depend on my judgment. I can't have you doubting me.
I see it. You could be the person that discovers life on Mars.
I need you here. I don't want you to go.
I'll never have the opportunity to do work this important. Imagine the responsibility the astronauts shoulder, the personal sacrifices that they've endured.
I need people who are going to do the hard thing.
And then they strap themselves to a rocket and they risk their lives. Enough already. That's 5 people. Fulfilling the destiny of 8 billion.
Excellent. So now we're going to pull up a slideshow that's going to show a first look at a couple of elements of the show that Beau can walk us through.
I'm just going to move over to this laptop really quick. How do I move? Yeah, we know how to get to Mars, but I'm not quite sure how to operate the slideshow here. So just these arrows right here. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to do this rather quickly, and then we can come back to slides as we get deeper into the conversation. But just sort of paint a broad strokes picture of our world. This is a view of our rocket. You could see that we're basically taking a large rocket approach with boosters. This is something similar to the SLS. In our conception of the near future, so this is a launch in 2031. During that launch window, we're considering a private-public partnership. Our fictional company is called Vista. You can think of that as somewhat similar to a SpaceX or a Blue Origin. In our conception, the bulk of the money has come from the U.S. government, from NASA, but they have contracted a company like Vista really to carry out the nuts and bolts of the mission with government oversight. And we do actually get a little bit into the complexity of what that means when you have government oversight over the private sector in an effort to get to Mars. Here's an image of a launch. That's our Earth Ascent vehicle making its way to the Mars Transit Vehicle, the MTV. Our design mostly involves a hard inner core so if you see that big cylinder to the right of the image, there's a hard inner core there that then has an inflatable portion. So you basically have a cylinder within a cylinder. We envision that there would be, say, about a half a dozen launches unmanned in order to get all of these components into low Earth orbit. And those components, once assembled, would look like this. Meanwhile, we're also doing launches to Mars over the course of several years during different launch windows to send things like rovers, land rovers, helo rovers, satellites, also our Mars Ascent Vehicle, which will allow the astronauts to launch back from the surface of Mars up to the MTV that's in orbit on their way home. The MAV will be making its own fuel on Mars, drawing from the CO2 in the atmosphere and frozen water beneath the surface. We'll get more into all of the details of the landscape and geography of our base camp and where our landing site's going to be later on in the story. Really, our first season is about getting to the starting line, getting to that first launch, and much of it is here on Earth. But we do touch upon some of the elements that I'm talking about right now. So that main big cylinder is where the astronauts hang out. You'll have everything from their comms deck to the galley to storage to sleeping quarters, workout area. One thing we're debating right now is we're designing the build we're extending this set so we can see the full spaceship in seasons to come. Are things like, do we want to incorporate a sled that can go in circles within the outer shell to give the astronauts basically gravity time, like for an hour a day. Things like this. We have to consider what the human impact of travel to another planet is on the body. We know things like the deterioration of bone density. We know different physiological effects that radiation can have in theory over a long period of time. All of these considerations are things that we have to think about, and we're working with former astronauts, NASA and others, to make sure that we tackle these in an accurate way. So there you can see the MTV in orbit around Earth as the EAV is making its way there. Sorry, let me go back to this image for a second. In the middle, you can see the docking port. There's a little circle there. That's where the EAV will dock similar that a capsule would to ISS. On the other side of that will be your Mars lander capsule, so that once you get to Martian orbit, you can detach, go to the surface, while the MTV hangs out for 18 months until you go back up and make your way back home during the next transit window. Where the solar panels are attached is really where all of your systems are located. You need plumbing, you need air filtering, CO2 scrubbers, all of your electronics, everything that makes the machine work. And then the final portion on the left-hand side of your screen is the engines. So this is a pretty pragmatic approach. It's not about how it looks on the outside. It's about the function. I happen to think it looks rather beautiful, but we're not trying to make slick science fiction rockets here. We're trying to make something that has the most bang for the buck in terms of its payload and its capabilities. There's some images from the inside of the core when our astronauts are strapping in for the first long burn that takes them out of low Earth orbit into interplanetary space. Here's a concept image of what it would look like when our Mars lander is making its way just beginning into the Martian atmosphere on its way to the surface. That heat shield is an inflatable. We're really interested in this sort of carbon-based synthetic inflatable technology, which really allows you to expand upon the infrastructure in a way that is cost-effective, that is light, and that allows you to pack something like this in a very small space. Here, one of the things we touch upon in the show is the engineering side of it. So here you see a vacuum tube that we created on our set, where what they're trying to do is well, I won't get into all the details here, but there's a problem with the MAV on the surface of Mars, which is jeopardizing the mission, and they need to try to fix it remotely. And one of the ways that they're going to attempt to do that is by using a rover to short circuit the power line between our small nuclear reactor on the surface of Mars and the MAV, which has stopped speaking to the engineers back on Earth. So they're looking for creative ways to essentially reboot the computer. And one of those is to use the drill on one of the rovers to try to short circuit the power cord and essentially reboot the computer. And of course, before you do something like that, 50 million miles away or more, you want to test it a bunch on Earth. So we want to make sure that we're paying homage to the thousands of people on the engineering side that are making all of this possible on a distant planet. Some images from mission control. AR technology is something that we're investigating as being a normal component of the near future. So you'll see people with AR glasses who are able to, look at computer screens standing by the pool in the back of their house, and this becomes a much more interactive experience that's integrated into our daily lives. Here's our spacesuits. These were built by actual spacesuit manufacturers. We work closely with former astronauts who now are consulting on real-life spacesuit manufacturing. So these things are about as close to the real thing as you can get. And I'm proud to say that all of our astronauts that came to set and saw these suits in person thought they were pretty nifty and said, yeah, wow, I wish we had these when we were up in space. These are some images from our version of our rocket build facility. We're also looking at things that house technology different here on the ground on Earth. I mentioned AR glasses. We're looking at self-driving cars, electric cars, what they might look like 13 years from now. So they're not crazy Back to the Future hovercrafts. They're still cars, but they look a little more futuristic than what we have now. That's the concept design. Here you see an actual car in a still frame from the show. I'll go really quickly through this, but when you're designing things like AR glasses that will be as ubiquitous as iPhones are now, you really have to design it down to the tiniest little detail. So this is early stages of us asking ourselves in a Steve Jobs sort of way, what do these glasses look like? And so each of these components here actually relate to real technology, everything from bone conduction devices that are, taking the sound directly into your skull so you don't need an earplug, to a power source, and also the aesthetic beauty of the thing. This world creation is something that was really important to us, so we didn't feel like we were just sort of like, and now you have magical glasses that can make you see computer screens floating in front of you. We really wanted to think through how would that happen. we're looking at all sorts of different ways that communication will be different 13 years from now, from earbuds and charging devices that you carry with you to bracelets to kits, basically, that are customized for what you want your communications experience to be. And of course, these elements will make their way up into the spacecraft. You can imagine, I was talking to Chris Hadfield about this on Friday, actually. You can imagine that if you're on the bike, which is something you have to do 2 hours a day on your way to Mars, that you could just be staring at, you know, a storage package in front of you, or you could have your AR glasses on that will allow you to bicycle through Central Park if you want, so that, you know, it's sort of like the 2031 or version of the holodeck on Star Trek, which is, you know, maybe not we can time travel back to like the Wild West, but I can have immersive experiences that help from a morale standpoint deal with the isolation of being in space and in a confined environment where I don't have access to the things that make me feel human. There's an example of Sean Penn wearing some of these glasses in the first episode. And I think that's it so that's the quick slideshow there. Now we'll jump into a conversation about, you know, the making of the show and the questions that we posed and what we found along the way.
So the first question that I have is for you, Beau. You know, in creating this series, is space exploration something that's been a personal passion of yours or a topic you always wanted to write about? Or were there specific themes about a human journey to Mars that you found specifically compelling?
Well, personally, I've always been drawn to science, which has also led me to space. I mean, I thought early on I was going to be a physicist, actually. That's what I was studying in college until I discovered the hard way that my math wasn't strong enough. So rather than having to make all the numbers add up and there being a right solution, I went to the land of make-believe, where you can kind of make up your own math. And then now I found my way back where I'm like, well, I've got to be right on the math again in order to create the most realistic story. But I'm also I've always been drawn to stories of like, I'm an adventure travel freak. Any story about, you know, going to the ocean depths, or about the first explorers making their way across the oceans, people crossing deserts, people climbing mountains. To me, that's an ancient story. There's an incessant, almost irrational need in us to know what's on the other side of the horizon. That goes back to the very first cave people who, you know, walked out of their cave, and one of them said, "I wonder what's on the other side of that ridge." You know, and so I see Mars as the latest iteration of that need. It's one of the things that differentiates us as a species, is curiosity, is that need to try to understand. And so it's both a futuristic story, but I think also speaks to a much deeper and ancient story within us that sets us apart. And any story that pushes people to their limits, to ask, what am I capable of? That are people that are willing to fail or even place themselves in great peril along the way in order to see what their limits are, is something that I find inherently dramatic. Those are real life issues for anyone that's going to Mars. I mean, you know from your training, I'm sure that you must be running up against your own limits all the time. And I also think that those sort of journeys where you ask yourself what your limits are can be as internal as they are external. So for instance, there's a character that is Sean Penn's fictional daughter on the show, who is an artist, and through her painting, she's trying to deal with her demons. I think her journey inward into the soul is just as vast and perilous as a journey to another planet in some ways. Looking at those comparisons, what are inward or spiritual journeys versus outward and scientific journeys, and seeing how similar they actually are, is an interesting way to approach a journey to Mars.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a journey to Mars, there's probably no one more uniquely qualified to advise on that than Charles. And I know, I'm sure almost everyone in this room is aware, but I think it bears repeating that during his tenure as center director, JPL landed 3 rovers on Mars, sent probes to the far reaches of space, and helped map our planetary neighbors for future robotic and human missions. So in consulting for a series like the first, what's important for you to get right? And when you see NASA depicted in film and television, are there any common misconceptions?
So let me, before I answer specifically that question, let me kind of expand on what you just asked. So the way I got involved, I was on vacation in Hawaii, and I got a phone call from a guy called Zach who was one of Beau's assistants, and he said, well, Beau Willimon would like to talk with you about advising them for a Mars series that they are doing. So I said, gee, that's another Hollywood guy who wants, to do another series. But I said, sure, I'll talk with him. So we chatted on the phone. I was pretty impressed with his idea, and then we made an appointment to get together for lunch at the Caltech Athenaeum. And as soon as we sat down, he started to ask me all these questions about Mars orbit ellipticity, windows for launching, speed of entry. And I said, wow, this guy is pretty smart. He really did his homework. So, I mean, even we could hire him at JPL. So going back to your first question about him, I was very impressed with how much both his passion about the movie, or the series, and then how much homework he has done. So at the end of the lunch, I'm sure I'll be glad to consult for you guys. But the key thing also, to answer now your question, he put a lot of emphasis that he really wanted the technical part to be very correct. He didn't want to do it as science fiction, another science fiction, kind of series. He insisted he wanted to make sure whatever design is done, whatever problems will happen, on Mars or in preparation for Mars and so on, are technically correct. I mean, of course, it's a drama. It's not a documentary that he's doing. So there will be a lot of the human drama in it, which in actuality, that's the real work. When you are telling somebody you are going to leave your family for 2.5 years, that's pretty, there is a lot of drama which goes in there, and Beau is trying to depict that, the drama of going for the first time to Mars and what happened to the astronauts and their family, people on the ground, and also about the interaction with the politician, with Congress. How do you convince Congress to spend these billions of dollars, on this adventure? So that's particularly what impressed me about the series, and what attracted me, to be involved in it, is his emphasis on making it as real as possible.
Absolutely. And LisaGay, you've had a prolific career across film, television, theater. You've worked with Beau before. What excited you the most about joining the cast of the first and working with Beau again to bring this story to life?
Probably the basic is a paycheck. That's the first thing.
Work is good.
Getting paid. The other is, just sitting here listening to Beau speak about all the technical aspects of the show, even the personal, all of that intellectual and emotional capacity and interest is attractive to any actor who wants to be able to ideally dig deeply as the artist. I'm never going to be a physics. I'm terrible in math, so that was never my path. My path has always been storytelling. And so being able to be a part of a show that I think Beau, or someone I've heard use, not science fiction, but science fact and science real, and that's something that I can actually, hold on to as an actor, is what are the real and emotional aspects to this story that is far-reaching from anything that I've actually even imagined in real life. So to have the opportunity to think about space tangibly and Mars, that was out of my realm. So being able to research something that you've never researched before is always so wonderful as an artist, because it just broadens your vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And Beau, you've obviously assembled a very high caliber group of advisors and consultants for the show. So how did you balance and strike this balance between scientific accuracy and then also creative freedom to imagine this near future?
Sure. Well, the science part sets up certain givens that you have to work within. So, in the same way that any story about humans has to take into account, like if you're telling a story that takes place in the winter, everyone's going to be wearing jackets, right? Like you start thinking of these given circumstances that then affect your story. So, there's certain hard givens on Mars. There's the physics of what it actually takes to get there. There's the fact that launch windows happen about every 26 months. There's the fact that it requires money, in order to do it. So you start saying, okay, these are certain things that dictate like hard and fast rules that I can't move away from. And then within that, you start to ask yourself the more human questions, like, and you start big and you move toward the specific, like what does it mean for a family member to say to another family member, at some point, I'm going to leave for 2.5 years. I mean, we know in human history, there's plenty of examples of this, people going away to war, or Shackleton heading off to try to traverse Antarctica. But what does it specifically mean when you're talking about people who will be farther away from Earth than any human has been by powers of magnitude? You know, when the risk assessment for this in terms of death is you know, something that you can speculate on and have a lot of bean counters try to place a percentage to, but because it's the first time, you can't completely know. What does that mean? I mean, one of my favorite scenes in the show is between LisaGay and her partner in the show. And her partner's been incredibly supportive of, you know, we see different types of families, some that are a little more shaky than others, but this is an incredibly supportive one. And yet, when they sort of come to the moment of truth, where there's the chances of there being a catastrophic failure on the way to Mars have increased due to some technical difficulties that they have not been able to completely overcome, all the astronauts have to go back to their families and ask again, okay, given this increased chance of failure, of death, how do you feel about this? And we see her wife actually, you know, be the supportive person she's always been, and yet she's really struggling, and there's a cost to it. And what does it mean to support your partner in doing something that will change humankind forever and make history in a profound way, and yet the potential cost of that is losing someone you love. Placing that in the context of the science, I think, is what makes it feel real.
Yeah, absolutely. And having watched a few episodes, I can say what strikes me the most about the show so far is this not a sci-fi show set in some alternate future. It really is just a gripping drama set pretty soon from now. And, you know, going back to something, Charles, that you mentioned earlier, you know, we're on our way. As you all know in this room, the human journey to Mars has started, and it starts here on Earth, largely thanks to folks like Charles and yourself who have dedicated careers to laying that foundation. But when it gets closer to us actually achieving this, it starts to feel like we're facing more of an economic challenge than an engineering challenge. And so what you mentioned before about convincing politicians, in your experience and in this current budget environment, how would you begin to convince politicians that an investment in science and exploration is essential?
Yeah, I think, as you said, I mean, we live in a political world, so we have to accept that. And it's very critical for people like you, your society, your individuals, to keep communicating to the politician that this is important. This is important for the future of our country. So one example I always use with them is look what happened during the Apollo days. I mean, I grew up during that time. I mean, I was in college when the Apollo landing, you know, took place, and it was fascinating. And it led to a lot of people being excited about exploration, science, technology, and even they didn't end being engineers. But it created this environment in our country of we can do great things, and we can take risks, we can be adventurous and do great things. And that embedded everywhere in our society at that time. And that became a key factor in our economic well-being. So I always, when I talk with a politician, you have to be prepared to what we call the elevator speech. You get only 1 minute, you know, the time, and you need to get them the message in 1 minute. In getting to be able to tell them that story. And fortunately, I think there are a number of politicians who are excited about space. I mean, I know one person in particular by the name of John Culbertson, who happened to be the chairman of the Appropriation Committee for NASA. He is absolutely fascinated with space exploration. So you need to nurture a couple of key politicians who are in the right position to become the advocates of doing that. And I almost found almost all of them, well, none of them is a scientist, but all of them who are excited had some class in astronomy or planetary science when they were in college. And they were fascinated, you know, by it. So that's the kind of thing that we need to keep emphasizing for them. And as I said, after all, they are your representatives, they are my representatives. So by keeping advocating to them that this is important, you know, to do, I think that's how we need to send that message.
Well, it's certainly one of our goals with the show. Every story that's told about what travel to Mars could look like is another drop in the bucket in terms of sort of increasing public awareness and public will for a mission like this. Political power comes from popular will. So we're hoping in our own small way that by dramatizing the story in a real way, will increase the appetite around the world for something like this.
Yeah, it's a good lesson for us as an industry too, to be mindful of, as we get closer, to not operating in an echo chamber, and to really make sure we're bringing politicians and the public into the fold and having real buy-in on what this means for us as a species. And LisaGay, you play one of the most experienced astronauts on the show, and I'm so curious how you began to prepare for that role and get in that mission-focused mindset.
Well, we were given tons of research to read, things like that. But for me, what's always tangible is when I can actually speak to a human being, as Beau obviously did, with experience and knowledge. And this is something that I knew nothing of, so I think honored being able to speak with Jeanette Epps, who was meant to go up to the space station. And it was a wonderful conversation with her about what it was like for her as a woman of color, to be a part of that institution. And obviously there's the technical aspect of learning about anything and everything that you have to know about to be prepared to go to space, to go to the space station. But there's also that emotional cost, and as Beau was speaking about, what is it like to take a job that actually is dangerous, and that is life and death. And if I understand correctly, one of the greatest challenges is the takeoff, right? And the landing. Those are the two most dangerous parts of the mission. And so I was able to ask Jeanette about the idea of how she felt about death and leaving family. And it was wonderful to hear her perspective about, what I've chosen to do is to spend as much quality time with each person in my family that I love, let them know that I love them, and then she said, I'm good to go. I really can accept whatever comes next because I believe so strongly in this mission. That sense of commitment and love to being able to die for something that you believe in, as King suggested, really solidified for me the idea of risk sort of leaves you for some strange reason. And you just are so focused on what can happen here, what are the greater possibilities, and being able to say, I'm okay in pushing that movement forward because I believe in it so much. So that kind of gave me something to hold on to.
I just want to add that there's also a great deal of physical endurance required to play these roles. I mean, folks like Kellie or the former astronauts that we've spoken to spend years training before their first mission, and we're throwing people into spacesuits that are pretty realistic, that are stiff, that are hot. We didn't necessarily have all the fans going and stuff like that, and and trying to make our way over to craft services and these things.
He's feeling really nice because after 2 minutes in the spacesuit, laying down like, no, cut, not working, can't breathe. I'm really, after 2 minutes, all of us were in a panic. But we really had to adjust. It was amazing.
Yeah, but even for instance, like there's a common thing that happens among astronauts sometimes is they're getting used to spacesuits, a claustrophobia that happens that can lead to sickness, and so like, yeah, we had that real life thing happening. I mean, I won't name names, and it wasn't LisaGay, but day one in the spacesuit, someone puked in their suit, from the claustrophobia, and our EAV is, which is like a pretty realistic looking capsule, that we built to specs and everything, was on a hydraulic set of hydraulic motors to simulate the shaking of takeoff. So these poor actors are spending 12 hours strapped in these seats in these spacesuits, and then we're turning the thing up. They don't do just one launch; they have to do like 20 of them. And this thing's shaking, and they're in this hot thing, and they can't hear the director very well because they got their helmets on. I mean, the physical toll was pretty extraordinary. And then we did some microgravity scenes as well, where obviously we don't have microgravity here on Earth, and you have to simulate it. So we had pretty advanced harnesses, which are similar to some of the harnesses that the NASA astronauts will actually use to simulate movement in a mock-up of ISS. And so these harnesses can rotate on 3 axes, and they're attached to it by cords to a track that allows them to move through the vessel. To learn how to move and operate in these things and make it look like you're in zero gravity is really hard to do. It took about 20 to 30 hours of training per actor just to be able to simulate that. So, you know, while they're in some ways very different engineering challenges than the engineers going to the real Mars will face, we had our own engineering challenges, and the actors were on the front lines of that, where the engineering hit the human, and their commitment to the training and to being able to simulate this stuff in a believable way was really extraordinary. And one more example I'll add of that is, you know, oftentimes astronauts, I'd be curious to know if you've done this aspect of training yet, they'll do something like a NOLS course, or basically an outdoor extreme team building and physical endurance type of training. Our show is set in New Orleans for a whole host of reasons. So our NOLS type training that we see the astronauts going through is taking place in the swamps. And these were real swamps, you know, with real crocodiles and real toxic water. And LisaGay and others are, you know, pulling sleds full of equipment, you know, through these swamps. Like, it's real. Like, what we're filming there is not CGI. They're actually taking themselves through the really sort of almost bone-crushing type of training that is required to get one's body and more importantly, one's mind in shape. And they threw themselves into it. So they didn't have the years of training. They just had their commitment to the craft. Yeah.
What was the most challenging part, physically challenging part of the training for you, or mentally?
The first day of the halter training for the anti-gravity, and literally after one spin, I'm like, take me now. Nurse had to be brought in. I had to take a Dramamine. I had to lay down, and they all assured me that after you do that once, so that's true. The next time it was better, but I thought to myself, "Oh, I'm going to get fired."
He got a little space sick.
Never be able to do this.
One of the big challenges we're going to face moving forward is once you get to the surface of Mars, of course, it's 1/3 gravity. It's actually a lot easier to simulate on screen zero or microgravity than 1/3. You know, I can have someone floating through a vessel and paint out those chords, but on Mars, how do I get someone to sort of do their sort of skip, hop, jump along the way of the surface? It would be a lot easier if I just had them floating in a lot of ways using green screen. But if we go to Jordan, Morocco, and are filming on the surface, how do I actually do that? So we're trying to figure that stuff out now. Like one example is we might have like an ATV that has a crane, and from that crane are some bungee cords that would be attached to someone in one of these spacesuits. And as they're sort of moving along, the bungees are helping create 1/3 gravity. So that would be how you handle just moving along the surface. That's technically difficult from a filming perspective, but also, you know, if I have this glass of water and I drop it, you know, it's actually easier to make it float than it is to make it fall at 1/3 speed. I can't just slow down the frame rate or speed up the frame rate so like 30 frames per second, because I can slow that falling down with frame rate, but then my astronauts would be talking at this speed. So, you know, it's interesting that in order to simulate Journey to Mars, you face a whole lot of kind of like engineering challenges on the film side.
I think adding to Beau's, because that illustrates how much you want it to be real. On Friday, we had a brainstorming session. We spent the whole day. Beau and a couple of his people, and Adam Stelson from JPL was a chief engineer. And the key thing you want to figure out is how do you handle the time delay, you know, in the communication. You know, in many of the video and the movies and so on, people are talking to each other on Mars and on the ground, but that's not real. So he's really thinking about how is it you want to create the environment and the discussion and the communication when you have a 10-minute, you know, or 12-minute delay. So that illustrates how much he's putting emphasis on realism.
We had a really fascinating discussion too about landing site, which, you know, it's funny because we're talking about places like Jezero Crater or Northeast Sternus like in this room at Caltech, but NASA for real is going to be having a conference like a month from now to talk about this for the 2020 mission. And then we're like, well, if we did something, let's say that results in we're sending the 2020 mission to Jezero Crater, that we could, in our story, if we put our landing site close to there, actually go and our astronauts in our fictional story can go and find the real rover that was sent in 2020 that happens to be, you know, sort of, you know, just sitting there at the edge of the crater. So.
And to add to it, again, as long as we're in this, he decided he wanted to have some of the staff go to the actual meeting where the decision will be made. So you can see how the scientists debate and what's the rationale of picking that.
Oh, it's amazing. And, you know, when we think about what we ask of our astronauts, and it's surprising that they're not more household names today, especially considering how exciting this is going to be in the future. And I'm curious for your perspective on this, because the public reception to the Mars rover program was pretty extraordinary. I mean, Curiosity is a celebrity in its own right. And so what do you think we could expect in terms of public global engagement when we actually land humans on Mars?
I mean, I was fortunate, as you mentioned. I was a director of JPL when we landed Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity. And a couple of things kind of really impressed me, which would reflect on what that. Number one is how many people were engaged, particularly during Curiosity. I mean, we literally had 1.6 billion hits on our website the day after we landed, you know, from all around the world. The other one, which always stick in my mind, that when we were doing Spirit and Opportunity, particularly when Spirit was having some problems, I got this email from a poet in Scotland, and it was a poem where he was saying that every morning he gets up and see what's happening to Spirit, his body, Spirit. And this is for robots, you know, that you get all that excited. So I could imagine when we land a human, or through basically the drama of sending a human and landing, I think that's going to be something which probably we haven't seen in centuries of doing that. The excitement of the public, and particularly the young people and the older people like me. Hopefully I still will be around when that will happen. So I absolutely would envision that's going to be a completely century-changing event that will happen when we land humans on Mars.
Yeah, it could be the, you know, the single biggest achievement of our species. It's almost a bookend, as we as Earthlings, and then the next chapter is we've unlocked interplanetary travel. And so considering what an important feat that is, not just for the US or individuals, but for the entire world. One of the things that I found most encouraging in the series is the level of diversity that's depicted in the show. The cast, the crew, the employees at NASA, the employees at Vista. I mean, that's a company I would want to work for. And I have to say, Beau, that is one area where I'm so grateful that you took creative liberty to imagine the future, because that has not necessarily been my experience in this industry to date. And yeah, it's true, we are making strides. We absolutely are making strides, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. But I've worked in the Mojave Desert at rocket companies where I'm the only woman full-time at the company with, you know, working on Mars landing technologies, and I've worked on many more teams where I am the only woman on that team, so it is very validating to see this level of diversity. And I've also watched enough film and television to know that that doesn't happen by accident. So I know that was a conscious decision, and I'm curious from you, why was representation so important to you to depict in the show?
Well, if you're going to tell the human story, then you got to tell a story about humans, you know, and humans exist in a world that is complex, that has a political and cultural landscape that, you know, we felt was important to not just reflect, but also investigate. You know, NASA, to its credit, has made, I think, a lot of strides in terms of the diversity of the astronaut corps, but, you know, it also is still struggling at times, and you can look at beyond NASA, really to any industry for that matter, and say, okay, we're very much in a cultural moment now where we're thinking about these things in a way that you know, these are issues that our world has been dealing with for centuries. But they're much more front and center in the conversation. And if your job as an artist is to reflect the world, you know, the change happens sometimes rather quickly, but on the whole, things are culturally a lot more gradual. And to think that 13 years from now we won't be confronting a lot of the same dilemmas, problems, and having the same conversations that we're having now, I think would be naive, or overly optimistic. That said, you have the opportunity in telling a story set in the near future to see progress, to see change in ways that I think could be realistic, and yet at the same time, without giving too much of the story away, I mean, we are addressing issues of race and gender head on, not just in terms of representation, but in terms of the story itself. I don't think you can divorce these things from a human mission to Mars. The people who go are going to be representing an entire species. They'll be representing, 8 to 9 billion people. Those 8 to 9 billion people are incredibly diverse, and if you don't have a true representation as best as you can with 5 people of the diversity of our species, then really are you sending all of humankind to Mars, or are you sending a subset? And so I think these discussions will be a big part of crew selection, and also the meaning, the impact it will have on all of us will be directly tied to these people, their personalities, their backgrounds, their perspectives, and who they speak to. So yes, we're all humans, but we're also a lot of different types of humans, with different backgrounds and perspectives, and I don't think you can just sort of skate past that, and so I felt, and the writers felt, and everyone we talked to felt that it was really important to engage with that.
Yeah, it's aspirational.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that that's wonderful, and the idea that space in many ways is only for certain kinds of people, that it doesn't reach all of the public schools that are here. So I think what our show also does is give everyone the opportunity to be included. So I think in terms of our publicity and how we do reach out, it's to all sorts of populations that should be watching the show, not that you're all Mars groupies, but not just folks who are interested in Mars, right? But everyone. So whether you're gay, whether you're Catholic, whether you're straight, I mean, it really does afford everyone, all the population, to really watch the show. So that's I'm looking forward to and hoping for, especially since I play a queer black female astronaut, that it really does open the world for a lot of people to watch the show, so we can have a lot more seasons.
Let me tell you a human story which I think is going to kind of reflect on this. A few years ago, I asked a young employee at Elachi, how did you become an engineer? How did you? He said, well, when I was in high school, I had no idea what I'm going to be doing when I grew up. And one day I was in the cafeteria and I watched this TV program, and it was these airbags which were bouncing on the surface of Mars. So I sat down and looked at it. It turned out the landing of opportunity. And she said, I was so fascinated by it. I said to myself, I want to be part of that. So she changed her thinking, went to college, and now she's a driver on opportunity. The things she saw, landing on Mars, now she's one of the drivers. So I could envision that millions of people are going to be watching this program. They are going to, particularly the young people.
Yeah.
We want to be part of that.
And sometimes it's hard to be what you can't see. So seeing representation on screen and seeing yourself reflected back in these amazing careers and achievements can be very validating. So I think that's an amazing story. And on a similar thread to sort of challenging the status quo, there was a TED Talk of yours that I loved where you had such a great quote just saying that it's so important to be bold and to keep pushing the limits. And so I'm curious to hear from you, where do you think we can afford to be bolder in space exploration? And in the next 10, 20, 50 years, where would you like to see the limits pushed?
Well, I mean, no question. First, every exploration requires bold people, to do that. Because by definition, exploration meaning you are doing something for the first time.
Right.
And therefore you are pushing the limit. And so I could envision that, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, traveling to Mars will become a little bit more of a routine. I mean, not routine in a sense, I just go to LAX and then fly to Mars. That would be a little bit more complicated than that. But it could be very much like what we have the station in Antarctica, where you have a group of people which actually go there. Some of them spend the winter, in Antarctica, so 6 months. This would be a little bit longer. But when I talk to scientists, colleagues at Caltech, they don't think about it. They think that that's normal. That's part of their exploration, is to go and do these kind of things. So I could envision 20 years from now that you have people which would go and do that as part of their exploration.
And one follow-up question to that, as we look at sort of this near future and something that first depicted so well and realistically is this public-private partnership, and in many ways it's the best of both worlds. You have the deep institutional knowledge of NASA, and then you have the agility and the operational tempo of private industry. How do you envision that partnership continuing or expanding as we expand our footprint in the solar system? Where would you like to see that go?
Yeah, no, I think really there are three parties for that kind of partnership. Clearly there is the government, and particularly for a major endeavor like exploring Mars. And I mean, you need the government resource, but think of it, the government is you. The government is not some other entity sitting there.
Right.
Then you have the commercial sector, and advances in technology now enabled a lot of companies, to be involved and to be part of it. And as you said, they move on a different tempo than the government, for good reason. I mean, the government is using taxpayer money; they have to be a little bit careful. Commercial sector tend to be a little bit more aggressive, because it's not taxpayers' money. And then there is the public. You and I, where you really are a key player, they have to be part of it. And I can see that combination of three elements is going to make this happen. And going back on, 20 years from now, when this has become real, I think people would look back at this program and you say, this program really got started, at least in the public mind. That this is something that we should be doing and we should be endeavoring.
Just to get into the public-private a little bit, and we're not going to do Q&A, but I see Mr. Zubin is here, and so you have thoughts about this, I'm sure. We sort of looked at the full spectrum from the lean and mean Zubin model, to a purely NASA mission that's many more years, many more missions, many more steps in the making. So, you could look at just on the money side, say from a 20 billion to a 500+ billion spectrum. And we envision something more in the middle. We put our price tag more around 75 billion in the near future. And that was looking at how do we minimize the number of missions, both for assembly in low Earth orbit and missions to sending hardware in advance to Mars. The truth of the matter is that in the private sector, I really don't, and look, we could be totally wrong about this, and there's a lot of healthy debates, but it's hard to envision the private sector doing this entirely on its own, given the cost. I mean, if the cost even of one mission to send humans there and back was, say, $30 billion, that's a lot of Teslas to sell. And if you're looking at sustaining the amount of, cash that's required to get there over multiple missions, that's really the sort of money that only governments have. Also, I don't think you can completely divorce national security concerns, the fact that, government still controls airspace, that, once you're looking at a mission to Mars, becoming more and more of a reality, it's tough to envision a government not wanting to slap a flag on the side
I know, we're right about time.
Right, sorry. So we're just about done here. But I think that we basically said what is the middle ground here in which we can believably see how the private sector would interact with the U.S. government so that we bring that price tag down, accelerate the speed at which we're able to get to Mars. And I think we did a fairly realistic job of that. I mean, we'll see in the near future whether we were right or not, but I think it's the most exciting way to think about, in a pragmatic approach, how we actually get there in the next decade or two.
So we're getting a very subtle warning that we're at time. So please join me in a round of applause. The first will premiere on Hulu on September 14th. That's Friday.
you want to know what I think of it, I like it. And here's a book that maybe you can make some use of.